Welcome back again, everyone. This is the fifth and, yes, final installment of our Chapter 13 lecture series. This section is entitled The Emergence of Lincoln. The focus question for this section is what enabled Lincoln to emerge as president from the divisive party politics of the 1850s, and how did this lead to civil war? Before we really get into our discussion of Lincoln and his rise, we need to discuss another one of those seminal events of the 1850s that galvanized those tensions between pro and anti-slavery forces in the United States. And this was the infamous Dred Scott decision. This was a famous Supreme Court case in which a slave, Mr. Dred Scott, whom you see right here, brought a suit to the courts that argued that because his master had took him to a free state and he had resided there with his master for a brief period of time, he claimed that his residence there on that free soil made him free. And this case was actually sought after by abolitionist lawyers who sought to use this as a way to get anti-slavery policies through into the U.S. government through the Supreme Court. Of course, this is one of the most infamous Supreme Court rulings of all time. The court in this case declared, number one, that Dred Scott's lawsuit was essentially invalid in the first place, that only white persons could be U.S. citizens, the first time that citizenship had been specifically designated for white people, and that because of this, Dred Scott was not a citizen and therefore could not bring forth any such legal suits against anyone. They also ruled that Scott remained a slave because Illinois law, which was the territory that Dred Scott briefly resided in, had no bearing in Missouri, which was the state that Dred Scott originally was from. It also declared that controlling the expansion of slavery, or the government's control of the expansion of slavery, was unconstitutional, that only the people could decide whether they wanted slavery or not in their particular territories or states. As a result of this decision, President Buchanan, a pro-slavery Democrat, declared that slavery now existed in all territories. Now, of course, this greatly inflamed Northern abolitionists and made them ever more determined to fight back against any such developments and ensure that expansion westward would be not at the cost of their free labor ideology. Northern opposition to all of these developments in the 1850s, the Compromise of 1850, the Fugitive Slave Law, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the caning of Charles Sumner, the Dred Scott decision, all served to galvanize the popularity of the Republican Party and their free soil ideology. And Abraham Lincoln emerged by 1858 as a star of this rising Republican Party. In 1858, Lincoln ran for a Senate seat in Illinois and faced off against Senator Stephen Douglas, the very architect of that very controversial Kansas-Nebraska Act. Now, he faced a strong challenge from Lincoln, who at this time was little known outside of his home state of Illinois. He opposed, Lincoln that is, opposed the expansion of slavery, but he was not an abolitionist. In fact, he had long been in favor of colonization and was a proponent of that policy in how to deal with slavery and African Americans in the United States. He believed in and preached wholeheartedly the free labor ideology of the Republican Party. Now, the campaign between Lincoln and Douglas was highly contentious, and Lincoln attacked Douglas's popular sovereignty as unsustainable, and of course used evidence from the episode of Bleeding Kansas to support that argument. Lincoln and Douglas engaged in a series of debates in this campaign that have since gone down as extremely famous, and some of the most important political discourses of the mid-19th century. Lincoln professed this idea of freedom as opposition to slavery. Douglas argued for his part that freedom lay in local self-determination, continuing to support his idea of popular sovereignty. Douglas won the race, but Lincoln's reputation as a passionate Republican was solidified, and this did much to increase his name recognition and his popularity, as the Lincoln-Douglas debates were widely publicized all across the United States in just about every newspaper. A final incident that really solidified the divide between North and South, and some have argued was really kind of the first opening salvo of the Civil War itself, was John Brown's raid on the Federal Arsenal at Harper's Ferry in 1859. John Brown, the gentleman you see here, was an extreme abolitionist, a very, very militant, probably the most militant of the militant abolitionists. He participated in the civil wars of Bleeding Kansas and was actually wanted on federal charges for the murder of a pro-slavery family in Kansas, including the women and children. In October of 1859, he led an armed assault on the Federal Arsenal in Harper's Ferry, Virginia, where he hoped to inspire a slave uprising that would take over the South and overthrow the slave power and, of course, abolish slavery. He was captured, actually, by Robert E. Lee, who was placed in command of the Federal Army sent to put down John Brown's rebellion at Harper's Ferry. He was placed on trial for treason and executed. And, of course, he was considered a martyr in the North and a villain in the South, and this further widened those sectional divisions. And that brings us to the election of 1860, perhaps the most contentious election of the entire 19th century. And this election was particularly noted for the fact that there was not just two candidates, but actually 5 candidates in all. In the North, both Lincoln and Douglas ran for the presidency and competed for that Northern vote. In the South, there were 3 candidates. The Democrats had split by this time into Northern and Southern Democratic factions who both put forward candidates for presidency, and another party had emerged just prior to this election, the Constitutional Union Party, which also put up a candidate for election. Lincoln carried the entire North in the Electoral College except for New Jersey. John C. Breckinridge, who was the Southern Democrat candidate, won most of the slave states. And Lincoln ended up winning the election through the Electoral College, despite the fact that he did not get a plurality of the popular vote, and he wasn't even on the ballot in the majority of the slave states, and won the presidency without a single vote in any southern state, which essentially made him, into the Southerners' eyes, the president of the North only, and did not represent the South in any way, shape, or fashion. To many in the South, Lincoln's victory placed their future in the hands of a hostile opponent. Southerners were convinced that Lincoln and the Republicans not only sought to prohibit the expansion of slavery, but sought to abolish slavery itself. As a result, 7 states succeeded months after Lincoln's election, and this placed slavery at the center of the motivations for secession. James Buchanan, who was still president at this time, even though he denied that a state had the right to secede, he also said the federal government could not use force against secession, and thus the states were able to succeed during the waning months of Buchanan's presidency. Of course, Lincoln would not support the expansion of slavery. As a result, the Confederate States of America were formed, which had a pro-slavery constitution and outlook. After those first 7 states succeeded, Lincoln did not at that time necessarily think that war was inevitable. He still sought some sort of avenue for negotiation and compromise to bring those succeeded states back into the Union. But he was determined to keep the Union together, and that was Lincoln's primary rhetoric at the time. At the outset of the war and in this prelude to the war, the rhetoric was all about preserving the Union, and the discussion of slavery was mostly avoided as to not further inflame those sectional tensions, and in hopes that they could bring the country back together through some sort of compromise deal. So again, that emphasis was not on the abolition of slavery at the opening stages of the conflict. It was all about, for Lincoln, preserving the Union. Well, after those 7 states succeeded, there were still some military installations in the South that were in federal or northern hands at the time, and this included Fort Sumter. As tensions continued to mount, especially after Lincoln's inauguration as president, Lincoln knew by that time that conflict was more and more likely, but he was hesitant to initiate that conflict himself. So he attempted to actually lure the South into firing the first shots in the conflict, whereby therefore Lincoln could then cast the blame for the conflict on the South. There was still a federal force stationed at Fort Sumter, which was in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina. And Lincoln essentially sent supply ships to those federal forces at Fort Sumter to try to resupply and reinforce those forces, something that Jefferson Davis, who by this time had been selected as president for the Confederacy, vehemently opposed and told Lincoln that any such attempt to resupply or reinforce Fort Sumter would be seen by the Confederacy as an act of war, and the Confederacy would respond in kind. Well, Lincoln ignored those warnings from Davis, sent those resupply ships in there anyway, and as a result, Jefferson Davis ordered batteries of cannon on the Charleston harbor to fire on the fort. Lincoln used this as justification to enter into a wider conflict and proclaimed that there was an insurrection in the South. He refused to recognize the authority to secede from the Union and considered the Confederate States not a separate entity, but essentially states that were in open rebellion against the national government. And as a result, after he declared this general insurrection, he issued a call to the remaining states of the Union, including those southern states that had not yet seceded, for them to enlist up to 75,000 militiamen apiece and send them to be used as a part of the federal forces that were poised to invade the South. This particular thing right here, asking these southern states like North Carolina, Virginia, and Tennessee, those especially upper northern or upper south states that had not yet succeeded, the very idea of raising troops on southern soil that would then be used by the northern government against the South itself was too much for most of these states to bear. And as a result, 4 more states joined the Confederacy after the incident at Fort Sumter, and the Civil War was on. Alright, gang, we've reached the conclusion of our Chapter 13 lecture series. As always, I hope you learned a lot, study hard, and we'll see you next time.